Well, yeah, I wouldn't believe it either if I didn't have the dates on the recordings.
Did you run out of space on the server?
No, not yet.
No, you ain't playing Hillary Clinton. That's your house.
So when we start here in just a minute, we're going to be starting in Daniel chapter 10.
Are you going to put any advertising boards for the book of Matthew?
Yeah.
Because I don't have anything to post.
Yeah, I'm going to put up a thingy. It'll be advertised. It's going to be a couple of weeks.
You know, you should put in their new curriculum coming, the New
Yeah.
Testament.
So we're going to start in a second in Daniel chapter 10.
University, the cathedral, is that in Homestead?
We finished through chapter 9 last time.
And then Homestead is lots over?
It's everyone. Somebody's in trouble.
So,
I can't hear you.
okay, so we're going to start here in just a minute in Daniel chapter 10. What we've got left is chapters 10, 11, and 12, and then there are a couple of other stories about Daniel. We talked about how in the Greek version there are these extra stories. And there's extra story of Bel and the dragon that's sort of stuck on the end. So we'll be getting to that tonight, most likely too. As we talked about last time, we're in now sort of the second main part of the book of Daniel. The first part, the first 6 chapters really, as we saw, were sort of stories, different events that happened in Daniel's life and in the life of his 3 friends. And then the second half of the book, starting in chapter 7, we've seen have been visions that Daniel had having to do with the future. And as we mentioned last time and talked about a little bit, chapters 2 through 7 of Daniel, remember, were written in Aramaic. Whereas chapter 1 and then 8 through 12 were written in Hebrew. And we talked about the fact that Aramaic was sort of the international language of the time in the 6th century. That there were people who spoke Aramaic all the way from Egypt, literally all the way to India at that time. And so when you're doing international trade, Aramaic was the language you used. So the content of those chapters of the book of Daniel would have been sort of available to everyone. Right? Just about anyone at that time who was educated enough to know how to read and write could have read it. Right? And anyone who understood Aramaic would have been able to have read to them to understand it. And we talked about how the content of those chapters, remember, had a lot to do with Nebuchadnezzar, had a lot to do with God's relationship to the whole world. And so it was kind of appropriate that those were written in Aramaic and available to everyone, not just the Jewish people. And we even saw in chapter 7, even though chapter 7 was a vision rather than these stories, that vision had to do with sort of the history of the whole world. Remember, it was the beasts coming up out of the sea, talking about the different empires that were going to rise and how all of those empires were ultimately going to fall before the kingdom of God. And so that message too was kind of directed to everyone in the whole world, right? To say, you put a lot of confidence in your empire and your power and your wealth in this world. Well, so did the Assyrians who have now fallen, right? So do you now, so will the empire who comes after you. And what they all have in common is they all fall, all those people are dead, right? And in the end, it's God who reigns forever. Then we saw in chapters 8 and 9 that we did last time, 8 and 9 it switches to Hebrew, and we talked about how at the time this was written, the Hebrew language was only spoken by a very small handful of people, even among Jewish people. Because once the temple was destroyed and once Judah was destroyed, everyone basically went to speaking Aramaic, which was sort of a similar, they're sort of cousin languages, sort of like Italian and Spanish today, where you could pick up one if you know the other, so everyone went to speaking Aramaic, and we saw, for example, in the book of Ezra, that when Ezra came and wanted to read the law to the people, read the books of Moses to the people, he had to get an interpreter to translate it into Aramaic, because most of them didn't understand the Hebrew, even when he was reading it to them, let alone being able to read it themselves. So we saw at the end of these visions in chapter 8 and in chapter 9 also, Daniel's told to sort of hide or conceal or not broadcast the contents of the vision he had. And we said one of the ways he does that is by writing it in Hebrew, right, instead of Aramaic. There's only going to be this small group of people who are going to be able to read it once it's written in that language. And we also saw how chapters 8 and 9 start dealing very specifically, instead of being general, talking about the world and God's relation to it in a general way, they started getting very specific about the nation of now Judea, right? And the future of the Jewish people, right, and what they should suspect. And at the core of that, we saw last time, was the idea that Daniel, he says, back Jeremiah, when he prophesied at the beginning of the exile, right, in 586, he prophesied that this exile would last for 70 years. Right? And in 516 BC, remember, under Cyrus, the Persian emperor, he did let some of the Jewish people go back and refound Jerusalem, rebuild the temple. So there was a temple there, but there were still Jews scattered all over Egypt. There were still Jews like Daniel scattered in Babylon, in the Babylonian Empire. Only a small group of Jews were there, and when they rebuilt the temple, even though they rededicated it, there was no evidence, at least that they saw, that the presence of God had returned to the temple, that had left before the old temple was destroyed. So Daniel prayed, remember, and said, well, the 70 years are past, plus a few extra. What's going on? Right? And the answer he got was that that exile was not in fact going to just last 70 years, but it was going to last 70 weeks of years, meaning 490 years. And in the visions that he had, it talked about not only this period, but that in the midst of that period, some other events would happen. So if this is 70 weeks of years, right? A week of years is 7 years. Then half of that is 3.5 years. Remember, in the visions, it kept saying after a time, times, and half a time, which is a way of saying 1 year, 2 years, and then a half a year. So 3.5 years. These other events would happen, right? So in the midst of that, and we talked about the event that's prophesied. Daniel called it in chapter 9, the Abomination of Desolation. And we talked about how that prophecy came true under the Greek emperor of Syria, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who in 175 AD went to the temple in Jerusalem and sacrificed pigs on the altar to a statue of Zeus. And so he sort of corrupted the Jewish temple and destroyed it. That was in 175. So Daniel prophesied that this event would happen, and that because of it, the sacrifices would come to an end, the daily cycle of sacrifices and feasts, because they couldn't use the temple anymore after that. Until, as we saw in the book of Maccabees, it was later rededicated.
So the book of Maccabees, even though it's back here, actually took place after all of this.
Yes. Yes.
Kind of
So-
in between the New and the Old Testament.
Right. So the way in the Orthodox Study Bible, the Old Testament follows the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament. And so the way it's ordered is it goes through the historical books first, roughly in order. Right. So you start with Genesis, go all the way through to Third Maccabees. Right, sort of in order in history. And then after the historical books, then it has the other books, like the wisdom book, like Psalms, Proverbs, those kind of things. And then the prophets are last. And so the prophets we've been going through now have sort of been scattered along the way through the historical books. So yeah, Daniel is prophesying this before the events in Maccabees happen. Okay. And so we talked about this, that Daniel prophesied. It happens in 175 BC. And he prophesied that that would happen after 3.5 years. And then at the end of the 490 years, that the Messiah would come, the Messiah would be killed, and the temple would be destroyed in Jerusalem. And we did the math, where if you take half of 490 years, that's 245 years. You add 245 to 175 BC, when Antiochus Epiphanes made his sacrifice, and you get 70 AD. That's the year that the Roman Emperor Titus destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. So Daniel predicted the exact year when that would happen, about 600 years before it happened. And even if you want to be skeptical, we know for a fact that the book of Daniel existed in multiple languages in 200 BC. It was written down by 200 BC. So even if you want to be as skeptical as possible and say it wasn't written at all until 200 BC, he still predicted Antiochus Epiphanes 25 years before it happened, and he still predicted the destruction of the temple 270 years before it happened. So either way, no matter how you slice it, he predicted it several centuries before it happened. Okay.
So the Jews knew it was coming.
The Jews knew it was coming, and that's why when, and we're going to talk about this more in the next few weeks as we start getting into the New Testament, they were able to do this math too from Daniel. And so in the first century, a lot of the Jewish people are looking for the Messiah. They're like, well, now's about time. Right? Now's about time for this to happen. And that's why we're going to see, like when Christ comes and he starts working his miracles, right? People start coming to him and asking him, are you the Messiah? And you might think, well, that's a weird, random question. Well, not if you're expecting him, right? Not if you're looking at Daniel and going, well, he should be showing up about this time. And now this guy showed up in town healing the sick, right? People start to connect the dots and say, well, maybe this is him. Unfortunately, at the same time, as we're also going to talk about, there were a whole lot of other people going around in the first century, either claiming to be the Messiah or having people believe they were the Messiah. Because again, they're doing the math here and saying, now's the time.
Now I can come out and become a shark.
Right? Yeah. That's, or, give some of them the benefit of the doubt. Some of them may have legitimately thought, I'm going to be the guy who overthrows the Romans. And, it didn't work out so well for any of them. But.
Barabbas, for example.
Well, no, Barabbas was just a robber. But Bar Kokhba, for example, we're going to talk about this more in the next couple of weeks, but he's the one who finally gets the whole city of Jerusalem leveled by the Romans. He manages to gain independence for Jerusalem for a total of 4 years from Rome. And people legitimately thought he was the Messiah. We have coins that were minted under him with his face on them that have the year 1. They were all ready for him to be Messiah. They were going to start dating things from him. Right? They were all ready to go. And then in the year 4, by that reckoning, the Romans came in and wiped him out and crucified him and tortured the rabbis who supported him to death. And that was the end of that. So I want to get back into Daniel, obviously, but one of the things we're going to see is that what's unique about Jesus is not that he showed up in the first century and people believed he was the Messiah. What's unique about Jesus is that he showed up in the first century, people believed he was the Messiah, the Romans killed him, and the movement didn't stop. There were lots of people showed up claiming to be the Messiah in the first century, and the Romans killed them. That's in horrible ways. But every single one except Jesus, once they were dead, that was it, everybody went home. So in the case of Jesus, something different, very different happened and produced a very different result. Yeah. Something very different happened. It produced a very different result. But that's one of the big evidences for the fact that Jesus really did rise from the dead, is the fact that, all these other movements, there's nobody running around today with a church dedicated to Simon Bar Kokhba. Nobody's saying he came back after the Romans killed him. Right? Jesus is unique. But okay, now let's get back to Daniel. So we'll have time for that in the next few weeks. So Daniel chapter 10. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of the Persians, a word was revealed to Daniel, whose name was called Belteshazzar. The word was true, and great power and understanding were given to him in the vision. In those days I, Daniel, was mourning 3 full weeks. I ate no desirable food, and no meat or wine entered my mouth, nor did I anoint myself until 3 whole weeks were fulfilled. Then on the 24th day of the 1st month I was beside the great river, that is the Tigris. I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, there was a man clothed in fine linen, and his waist was girded with gold of Uphaz. His body was like beryl, and his face was like the appearance of lightning. His eyes were like lamps of fire, and his arms and legs like the appearance of shining brass. The sound of his words was like the voice of a multitude. I, Daniel, alone saw the vision, for the men with me did not see the vision, but a great astonishment fell upon them, and they fled in fear. So I was left alone and saw this great vision, but no strength remained in me. For my splendor was turned into corruption, and I retained no strength. Yet I heard the sound of his words, and when I heard him, I was deeply troubled with my face on the ground. Okay. No. But so this person appears to Daniel, right? He looks like he's made of metal and gold and shining, right? And when he appears, all the other people who are with Daniel run for the hills, right? That's basically, they take off. Daniel himself just falls on his face on the ground, right, in front of him. So verse 10, suddenly a hand touched me and raised me up on my knees. He said to me, O Daniel, a man of desires, understand the words I speak to you and stand upright, for now I have been sent to you. So when he spoke this word to me, I stood trembling. Then he said to me, do not fear, Daniel, for from the first day you set your heart to understand and to afflict yourself before your God. Your words were heard, and I came because of your words. What does it mean to understand and to afflict yourself? Basically, what Daniel was saying at the beginning was that he was fasting and he was praying because he wanted to understand. He wanted to understand what's happening to his people. As we saw last time when he asked about the 70 years, right? He sort of had one understanding of what was going on, right? His understanding was, well, okay, the people sinned, they were sent into exile, they're in exile for this period, but then when this period is over, they're all going to go back to Jerusalem, and then God's going to establish His kingdom on earth, and everything's going to be wonderful. Right? And so that isn't happening, right? So he doesn't understand it. And so what Daniel is being commended here for doing is, how he tries to understand is by praying and by fasting and by asking God to reveal to him so that he can understand what's going on and pass that understanding on to the rest of his people. Okay, so the person who appears to us as, from when you very first started asking and fasting, right? I was sent to talk to you. Verse 13, but the prince of the Persian kingdom withstood me 21 days. And behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I was left there with the ruler of the Persian kingdom. Now I have come to make you understand what will happen to your people in the last days, for the vision is for days yet to come. Okay? Yeah.
All right, so according to this verse, then, does each nation have an angel protecting it or in charge of it? And is this what Paul means?
That's where I'm about to go.
Well,
Yeah.
is this what Paul says about principalities in the air?
This is related to that, yes.
Thank you.
Yes. First, we got to go all the way back to Deuteronomy. All the way back in Deuteronomy, there's a reference to God having apportioned the nations. Right? And by portion means giving them their land, their areas, deciding where they would be and when they would be. Right? When they would exist, when they would rise, when they would fall. But it says that He apportioned them according to their angels. And we talked about this way back when, 4.5 years ago, but I don't remember. But, and that was conveying the idea, and here we find it again in the Old Testament, that not only do, as we're probably more familiar with, do individual people have guardian angels, but that there were angels who God set to administer over different parts of the earth. Over different parts of the earth and over different nations. Okay. And we know from passages like this, and from what St. Paul is going to say, and from in the Psalms, that some of these angels who were put in charge of these other nations are some of the angels who fell with Satan. And this is why, for example, it says in the Psalms twice, and St. Paul quotes that all the gods of the nations are demons. Because the idea is that the Bible doesn't say that these gods that the other nations worship don't exist. What the Bible says is that the gods who these other nations worships aren't God, right, first of all. But that they're lesser spirits. They're basically angels. They're spiritual beings who are created by God, who shouldn't be worshipped as gods, but who are by these various nations. And so part of what this is getting at is an understanding that going even further back in Genesis 3, when human beings fall into sin. Remember when God creates Adam and Eve, He tells them to fill the earth and subdue it, right? And He says that He's given them dominion over all the birds of the air and the fish of the sea, right? He puts human beings in charge of the world with the intent that they'll be caretakers of the world, right? And fill the world, care for it, and ultimately offer it back to Him in thanksgiving, right? That is the goal. But He put them in charge of it. When Adam and Eve choose, rather than following God, to follow the serpent, to follow Satan and his guidance, that they gave control of this world over to him and to the spirits that are in allegiance with him. And so we get references to this all through the Bible. This is why in the Gospel of John, when Jesus is about to go to the cross, He says, "Now is the hour of the judgment of the prince of this world." And the prince of this world He's referring to is Satan. That he's going to defeat him. And so what we see Christ do, and St. Paul talks about this quite a bit in terms of the powers and principalities of this world, is that Christ, through His death and resurrection, defeats them, and He takes dominion over this world back. And so this is why right before He ascends into heaven, He says, "All power in heaven and on earth has been given to me." Right? He now has all authority. So, looking at it that way, sort of the narrative of the Bible, you start out with God creates the world and puts man in charge. Man gives control over to Satan through sin and the power of death. And then Christ comes and defeats Satan and takes that authority and control back. And so that's what this is again referring to. So what this angel is saying to Daniel is, I've been on my way here for 3 weeks. Right? Basically, I came here to see you. I got into a tussle with the demon who's in control of the Persian Empire right now, right? Which would be, in context, the gods who the Persians worshipped, remember, was Ahura Mazda.
Yeah.
Right? So he said, I got into this tussle. The Archangel Michael came and intervened, and now I'm here to answer your questions. Right? That's sort of the short version of what he's saying. And we're going to see other discussions like this when we get all the way to Jude, which will probably be a couple more years. But when we get to Jude in the New Testament, he's going to talk about when Satan and the Archangel Michael fought over Moses' body. And we'll talk about this a little more then. But that's the imagery here. Right? The imagery here is we're still in the Old Testament, we're still before Christ. Right? And so Daniel, the people are still in bondage to sin and to death, right, to this cycle. That's why Daniel's upset, is he wants to know when, right, when is this going to be over? When is this age going to come to an end and the next stage going to begin? And so now this angel has made it through, sort of fought his way through to get to Daniel and tell him what it is that's going to happen. So verse 15, when he had spoken these words to me, I turned my face toward the ground and was deeply troubled. Again, suddenly, one having the likeness of a son of man touched my lips, and I opened my mouth and spoke, and said to the one standing before me, My Lord, because of your vision, my insides churned within me, so I have no strength. For how can your servant, my Lord, speak with my Lord of this? As for me, no strength now remains in me, nor is any breath left in me. Then again, the one like the appearance of a man touched me and strengthened me. He said to me, O man of desires, peace be to you. Be courageous and strong. So when he spoke with me, I was strengthened and said, Let my Lord speak, for you have strengthened me. Then he said, Do you know why I have come to you? But now I will return to the war against the ruler of the Persians, and I will go forth, and the ruler of the Greeks will come. But I will tell you what is noted in the scripture of truth, and there is no one loyal to me concerning this except Michael your prince. So he gives him this vision. He hasn't told us what the vision is yet. That's about. We're about to read that. Right? He tells us this vision. Gives it this vision. When Daniel has this vision, he says his insides churn. Meaning, it didn't leave a good taste in the pit of his stomach. Right? It wasn't a happy vision. And then the angel tells him, "Well, I've got to go. We've still got some fighting to do with the rulers of the Persians, and then after that, we've got to deal with the Greeks, right? Because they were the next empire to come up to bat." Okay. So now here in chapter 11, we're going to get the content of what the vision was. As for me, in the first year of Cyrus, I stood in power and strength. Now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 kings will yet arise in Persia, and the fourth shall be far richer than all of them. And after he possesses his wealth, he will rise up against all the kingdoms of the Greeks. Then a mighty king shall arise, and he shall rule a great dominion and do according to his will. After his kingdom is established, it shall be crushed and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not among his posterity, nor according to his dominion with which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be uprooted and given to others besides these. Okay, so he says we've got 3 kings of the Persians coming, and then a fourth. And the fourth king, the fourth emperor of Persia was Xerxes. That's who he's talking about, sometimes called Xerxes the Great. That's who he's talking about when he talks about this fourth king who's richer than all the other ones. Xerxes, we talked about how Cyrus, who was reigning when Daniel had this vision, had conquered a huge chunk of the known world. Xerxes is the one who is going to fight the wars against the Greeks, both by land and sea. He's going to end up taking over pretty much all of what's now Turkey, and he's going to start attacking the Peloponnese, the main part of Greece. If you saw the movie 300 or the sequel, the Persian king in that is Xerxes. Not that those are super historically accurate, but they're depicting those wars that happened under Xerxes. So Xerxes is going to be sort of what the angel is saying here, and what is historically true, is that Xerxes is going to be sort of the high watermark for the Persian Empire. It's going to be the biggest it gets, the most powerful it gets, the wealthiest it gets. Toward the end of his reign, he's going to start losing to the Greeks. He's going to start being defeated. His son Artaxerxes, and following that, the Persian Empire is going to start shrinking. And then, as we go on here in the prophecy, it talks about the mighty king arising, referring to Alexander the Great, who's going to come and destroy the Persian Empire. But as it says, he's not going to get to enjoy his empire, because as soon as he's done conquering it, he dies, and as it says, he doesn't leave it to his posterity. He doesn't have any sons to leave it to. And so it gets divided up by his 4 generals. And that's what it's talking about with the divided into the 4 winds.
I'm sorry I didn't catch this sooner, but I would like to have your interpretation on chapter 10, the last verse, 21. Because I have a question. But I will tell you what is noted in the scripture of truth. Okay?
Yeah.
There is no one loyal to me concerning this, except Michael, your prince.
Right. I'm going to put a pause.
Pause.
Here's why. Because chapter 12, we're going to come back to this. So hold that thought. And if when we get to chapter 12, I don't answer it sufficiently, ask again. Okay. Okay. So then in verse 5, also the king of the south shall become strong, and one of his rulers shall prevail against him and have power over a great dominion under his authority. Okay, so now we're after Alexander the Great. Okay, we've already talked about up through Alexander the Great. His 4 generals split up his empire. So in that context, who's the king of the south? Well, the king of the south, I don't know, I'm supposed to draw a bad map. But the king of the south is going to be his general Ptolemy, and his descendants take Egypt and North Africa. That whole section of that Alexander the Great conquered. That's in the south. And then remember the Seleucus takes Syria eastward of what Alexander the Great conquered, and then he's got a general in Macedonia and a general in basically what's now Greece. But so the king of the south that this is referring to is the Ptolemaic king of Egypt, right? The Greek king of Egypt after Alexander the Great. Verse 6, after his years they shall join forces, for the daughter of the king of the south shall go to the king of the north to make an agreement with him. The king of the north being the Seleucid king of Syria. But she shall not retain the power of her authority, and neither shall his seed stand. But she shall be betrayed along with those who brought her, the maiden and he who strengthened her in those times. For from the flower of her root one shall arise in his readiness, and shall come against the host, enter the strongholds of the king of the north, and deal with them and prevail. Then he shall also carry their gods to Egypt with their molten images and all their precious vessels of silver and gold, along with a host of captives. Thus he shall stand above the king of the north. Then he will come against the kingdom of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land. But his sons shall assemble a multitude of great forces. Thus when he comes, he shall come and overwhelm and pass by, then he shall rest. Again he shall contend to the extent of his strength. Then the king of the south shall be angered and go out and fight with the king of the north, who shall muster a great multitude, but this multitude shall be given into his hand. For he will defeat the multitude, and his heart will be lifted up. Yes, he shall cast down tens of thousands, but will not prevail. For the king of the north will return and muster a multitude greater than the former. And at the end of some years his invading army shall come with a great force and much equipment. Okay. So what this is describing is, essentially, and this is what will happen over the course of the end of the 4th century and the most of the 3rd century, is that the Seleucid kings in Syria and the Ptolemaic kings in Egypt will pretty much constantly make war against each other and try to invade, because they share this border and they're both trying to take territory from the other. The Nile Cataract going south in Egypt towards Ethiopia is very difficult to navigate with an army or anything else. So if you control North Africa and you want to expand your territory, the easiest way to go is east, right? And to come up through Palestine, come up through into Syria, and try and conquer in that direction. And vice versa. The Seleucid king, is trying to expand southward into Africa. So there's sort of constant back and forth invasions between the two for about 100 years. Verse 14, now in those times many will rise up against the king of the south, even the sons of troublemakers among your people shall exalt themselves in fulfillment of the vision, but they will be weak. It's basically saying even the Jews will get involved in this back and forth between the two of them. So the king of the north shall come and build a siege mound and take fortified cities, and the arms of the king of the south shall not withstand him. His choice troops will rise up, and there shall be no strength to resist. But he who comes against him shall do according to his will, and no one shall stand against him. He will stand in the land of beauty, and it shall be consumed by his hand. He shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and he will do whatever seems right to him. He shall give him the daughter of women to corrupt her, but she will not remain with him or before him. After this he shall turn his face to the islands, and shall take many, and cause rulers to cease from their disgrace. Nevertheless his own disgrace shall turn back on him. Then he will turn his face toward the strength of his land, but he shall stumble and fall and will not be found. That's saying, again, talking about the Seleucid king, that in addition to attacking Egypt and overtaking Judea, that's the land of beauty, right? Is the land of the Israelites. In addition to fighting in that direction, taking that, he's also going to start invading the islands along the coast, right? The Greek islands and Tyre, trying to add those to his territory. Verse 20, now a plant of the kingdom shall arise from his root and pass over in his readiness. He will further the glory of the kingdom, but in those days he shall be crushed, but not openly or in battle. After this one shall arise in his readiness and be set at naught. Yet they did not give him the glory of the kingdom. Nevertheless he shall enter with prosperity and seize the kingdom by intrigue. Then the arms of him who overwhelms and the ruler of the covenant shall be overwhelmed and crushed by his presence. Then after the leagues made with him he shall work deceit, for he shall come up and overpower him with a small number of people. He shall come into the prosperous and wealthy places of the provinces and do what neither his fathers or forefathers have done. He will disperse plunder, spoils, and wealth among them and devise his plans against Egypt, but only for a time. Then his strength and his heart shall be stirred up against the king of the south with a large army. The king of the south shall engage him in war with a very large and mighty army. But the king's forces shall not stand, for they will devise plans against him. They shall eat his provisions and crush him. His army shall be overwhelmed, and many shall fall down slain. Now both kings in their hearts will be set on evil, and they shall speak lies at the same table. But the evil will not prosper, for the end is yet at the appointed time. Then he shall return to his land with abundant possessions, but his heart shall be against the holy covenant, so he shall do evil and return to his own land. This is now, we're talking about Antiochus IV Epiphanes, because he comes to power illegitimately. He kills off several of his cousins and rival claimants to the throne in order to get there. That's what's being referred to that he shall enter with prosperity and seize the kingdom by intrigue at the end of verse 21. That's talking about Antiochus and how he's going to devise greater evil than his predecessors, and how he's going to be set against the covenant. The covenant meaning he's going to openly oppose, right? None of his forebears were going to go and offer pigs to Zeus, obviously, in the temple of the Jews. Because remember, as we've seen earlier in Daniel, even in the stories, while maybe Nebuchadnezzar did, but for the most part, these pagan emperors aren't going to convert to Judaism, right? They're certainly not going to go and be circumcised, right? Start following the law. But they're more than willing, as good sort of pagan polytheists, to honor some of their nation's gods, right? They don't see a problem with just, oh, well, that's your God, okay, well, we'll pay him a little respect too, right? Just cover all your bases. That's just a case. And most of them, are going to say, look, there's no point. I don't really know who this God is or anything about it, but there's no point in having him get mad at me, right? You're not going to do it. That can't give me any benefit, right? So we'll just cover all the bases. This is part of what's going on in Homer's Iliad when Achilles, before going into battle, he goes and desecrates this temple of the Trojans and kills all of their priests, and everybody's like, what are you doing? Not because they particularly worship the gods of the Trojans, but they're like, why are you going to go and get them mad at us before we're going to go into battle? Like that can't help us, right, going forward, right? So this is what it's referring to when it talks about him setting himself against the covenant, doing something that even his ancestors wouldn't do. The idea that you would go and sort of deliberately antagonize some other nation's God in this way was sort of unheard of in the ancient world. It was just seen as a bad idea, just on a superstitious kind of level, Okay, verse 29. At the appointed time he shall return and come into the south again, but this last coming will not be like the first. For the Chaldeans shall go out and come against him, and he will be humbled. Then he will return and be enraged against the holy covenant. He shall do evil and return and show regard for those who forsook the holy covenant. Then offspring shall arise from him, and they shall defile the sanctuary of power. They shall take away the daily sacrifice, and place there the abomination of desolation. Transgressors will bring about a covenant by deceitful means, but the people who know their God will be strong and do valiantly. Those of the people who understand shall understand much, yet they shall be weakened by sword and flame, and by captivity and days of plundering. When they are weak, they shall be aided with a little help, but many shall join with them by intrigue. Some of those of understanding shall fall. To refine them is by fire and test them, so they may be revealed at the time of the end, because the matter is still for the appointed time. Then the king shall do according to his will. He will be exalted and magnified above every god, and speak arrogant words. He shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished, for it is to be ended. He shall not regard any gods of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor shall he regard any god, for he shall exalt himself above them all. But in his locality he shall honor a god of fortresses, and a god his fathers did not know he shall honor with gold and silver, and with precious stones and desirable things. Thus he shall do in the strong fortresses of refuge with a foreign god, and he shall increase his glory. He shall subject many to them and distribute gifts in the land. Okay, so this obviously is talking about what Antiochus Epiphanes did in the temple, right? Then committing the abomination of desolation, and the destruction that was going to be brought on the Jewish people at that time, where only a few were going to be able to stand bravely. We saw in first and especially in second Maccabees how under Antiochus Epiphanes, in addition to doing this to the temple, he outlawed circumcision, he outlawed keeping the food laws in the Old Testament, and so the Jewish people literally had to decide, and this is much the same way Daniel and his friends did, do we go along with the Greeks and worship their gods? Do we go along with the Greeks and stop following God's law? Or do we get tortured and killed? That was a very real dilemma for them throughout that period. Right? And that's what it's talking about here, how some of them would forge an unholy covenant. That's talking about the ones who would just go along with the Greeks. Right? They would say, okay, well, forget about our God, we'll worship yours. Right? And then that way we won't be persecuted, right? This way we'll just become good Greeks, good Greek citizens. Whereas only the few were strong enough to stand up and resist. Verse 40, at the time of the end, the king of the north will attack the king of the south and come against him with chariots, horsemen, and many ships. He shall enter his land, crush it, and move on. He shall also enter the land of beauty, and many shall fall. That these shall escape from his hand, Edom, Moab, and the prominent among the children of Ammon. He shall stretch out his hand upon the land, and the land of Egypt will not escape. He shall gain control over the hidden stores of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt, and of all the Libyans and Ethiopians and their strongholds. But rumors and anxieties from the east and the north will trouble him. Therefore he shall come with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. He shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas upon the holy mountain of beauty, and he will come to his portion, but there shall be no one to deliver him. So, Antiochus Epiphanes, despite considering himself a god and greater than all the other gods and all the other rulers of the earth, he ends up dead, just like all the rest of them. Right? There's no one in the end who's going to come and save him. Okay. So, the picture here. Why does the angel come and give Daniel this message? It's not really reassuring. Right? Remember, Daniel's concerned. Daniel's been looking at the other prophecies about what's supposed to happen. right? What the destiny of Israel is supposed to be. And as we saw going through the prophets, there's this sort of pattern in all of them where, they were going to go into exile and they were going to be punished and they were going to be judged, right? And then through this period of judgment, there was going to be a remnant that was going to be sort of refined by the judgment instead of destroyed. And this remnant of Israel, right, then the Messiah would come, and then all the people from all the nations of the world would come in and join with that remnant of Israel in worshiping Israel's God. Right? That's sort of this pattern that he sees over and over again in the prophets. Well, he's sitting at the end of this exile period, right, and going, okay, right? My whole life I've been in exile in Babylon. I've nearly been killed a good 4 or 5 times, right? Just for trying to follow God's law. I've had people out to murder me. It's been pretty rough. When are we getting to the other side of this? Right? When are we getting to the other side of this? And what the angel tells him, this is why his stomach gets twisted and turns when he tells him is it's going to get worse before it gets better. It's going to get worse before it gets better. It is going to get better. Right? These other things are going to happen. Right? The Messiah is going to come. Right? And people from the nations all through the world are going to come and worship Israel's God with the remnant of Israel. But there's going to be some more time, 490 years more time, in producing that remnant. There's going to be a lot more trials and a lot more testing like what Daniel went through for the nation before the time comes when the Messiah comes. So what we're seeing in Daniel and his vision is sort of a corrective to a potential misunderstanding, right? Misunderstanding of what those prophets were saying, sort of a triumphalistic reading, an answer to the idea that, okay, well now 70 years is up, so now we're all going to march back into Jerusalem and become the rulers of the world right, from Jerusalem, and all have Gentiles as slaves, right? Which is what some Jews still today interpret as going to happen in the end times. Daniel comes along and through the visions he has says, no, that's not really how it's going to be. Right? That's not really how it's going to be. It is going to get better. There is going to be this Messianic age. There's going to be a long, hard road to get there. We're going to see in the New Testament, when we get to the book of Revelation, that the book of Revelation functions in a lot of the same way. Because already, in some of the later books of the New Testament, like in 1st and 2nd Peter, we have Christians with the same kind of idea. Right? We have Christians saying, well, we were told Jesus was the Messiah, and he came, and we and all these other Gentiles converted and became Christians, and we were told he was going to come back and rule the world and set everything right, right, and that everything's going to be good. And they're looking at their watches, now we've got the Romans killing us, what's going on, right? This doesn't seem to match up with what we're told. And so St. John is going to have a vision, much like Daniel's vision, where he's going to lay out, well, it is going to get better, and Jesus is going to return, right? And he is going to set things right. But there's a road between here and there that we're going to have to travel. So, but that's going to be a couple of years yet before we get to Revelation. But we'll see. There's a parallel here. That this is the purpose of this vision. Is again, apocalyptic in these visions aren't predictions of the end of the world per se. They're giving God's perspective, right? Helping them put what they're experiencing and where they are in history in the bigger perspective. Yes, things are going to get worse before they get better, but they are going to get better. So now chapter 12, verse 1. At that time, Michael, the great prince, who stands watch over the sons of your people, shall stand up, and there shall be a time of tribulation such as never happened until that time, since there was a nation upon the earth. But at that time your people shall be saved, all found written in the book. Then many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to disgrace and everlasting shame. Those who understand shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, and some who are righteous like the stars of heaven forever and ever. As for you, Daniel, close up these words and seal the book until the time of the end, until many are taught and knowledge is increased. So, after all this, right? Remember he says, Michael, your prince? Right? Chapter 12, verse 1. Michael, the great prince, who stands watch over the sons of your people.
Israel.
Right, so Saint Michael, right, is among those angels who are apportioned to the different nations. He's the one who was given the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel. To guard and watch over. So, then at the end, after this, right, then is going to come the period of the Messiah. Then is going to come the period where the dead are raised, right? He's either to life or to condemnation. And again, we have here, as we've been going through the Old Testament these last few years, remember when we started out back in the Pentateuch and it talked about what happened after you died, it was kind of hazy. There were references to being written in the book of life. Even Moses made those references, and we see one again here, those whose names are written in the book. But they talked a lot about the grave. So here in Daniel, it's very clear the resurrection of the dead. And what's going to happen at the end, Messiah comes, is that the dead are going to be raised again. Okay. And notice, this will be relatively soon, probably the beginning part of next year. When we get towards the end of Matthew, there's this kind of weird scene when, weird if you think about it too hard like I have. Scene at the end of the book of Matthew, when Christ dies on the cross, it says that the tombs were opened, and many of the saints, many of the holy ones, the same word as here, in Judea, rose from the dead, but they didn't come out of their tombs until after Jesus rose from the dead. The reason I say that's weird if you think about it is, that means they rose from the dead and just kind of sat around in their tomb for a couple days. Right? Like if you take it real literally, right? Then they're like, well, what, huh? Well, better see if this sticks. You know, I mean, but then when Christ rises from the dead, they all come out. We'll talk about that more when we get to it. There's a couple of different levels of symbolism and stuff going on there. But what?
Chapters are in the book of Matthew.
What? 28. But and that's in chapter 26. But this is. But part of it is that this prophecy here is being fulfilled. That this is the mark that now the Messiah has come, and now these prophecies are being fulfilled. Because remember in Daniel, when he talks about this 70 AD, when he talks about what's going to happen at the end of the 490 years, it's what? The Messiah is going to be killed, and then the temple is going to be destroyed. Right? So we see at the end of Matthew, the Messiah is killed, and what happens? This is sort of to clue us in. Okay, see, look, the prophecy that Daniel gave is being fulfilled now in what's happening with Jesus. But we'll come back to that when we get to the end of Matthew. So verse 5, Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, there stood two others, one on the riverbank and the other on the other riverbank. One said to the man clothed in fine linen who was above the water of the river, How long will it be to the end of these wonders of which you have spoken? Then I heard from the man clothed in fine linen who was above the water of the river, as he held up his right hand and his left hand to heaven, and swore by him who lives forever, that it would be for a time, times, and half a time. Thus when the dispersion is ended, they shall know all these things. So remember we talked about the 3.5 years here. So that's reiterated here, right? That 3.5, remember it's 3.5 weeks of years, so 245 years. Verse 8, Although I heard, I did not understand, so I said, My Lord, what shall be the end of these things? He replied, Go your way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. Many shall choose to be made white and refined through fire, but the lawless shall act lawlessly. None of the lawless shall understand, but the wise shall understand. From the time the daily sacrifice is taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits and comes to 1,335 days. But now go your way and rest, for there are yet days to the fulfillment of the end, and you shall rise to your inheritance at the end of days. Okay. So, the difference between the two there, you may have noticed, is 45 days, right? They're both, if you work out those days based on a 360-day year, I won't make you go through all the math, based on a 360-day year, they're both 3.5 years, just converted into days, right? With a difference of 45 days, which if you put that into the 70, you get 95 AD, right? So there's this window, right? There's this window, and as I said, we'll talk about more in the next couple of weeks. This is what people are looking at, right? This is what people are looking at the first century in terms of when they're expecting the Messiah to come and these things to start being fulfilled. Okay. So that, even though it's not demarcated here, that's the end of chapter 12. That's the end of chapter 12. That's the end of the book of Daniel proper. That's how it ends, is 3.5 years. Now go your way and rest, for there are yet days of fulfillment of the end, and you shall arise to your inheritance at the end of the days. That go your way and rest is literally what it's saying in the original, in the idiom, is basically saying this vision is the last vision Daniel had at the end of his life. Right? So go your way and rest means
Goodbye.
yeah. But remember, he's going to rise again to his reward at the end when all this happens.
So Daniel basically dies here
Yeah.
at the end of this when God tells
Yeah.
him. Okay.
Now we have here, because in the Orthodox Study Bible, we're translating the Greek version, we have this extra Daniel story, right? That gets added onto the end. That's another story about Daniel. So by putting it here on the end, it becomes kind of anticlimactic. But to make the point that that's really where Daniel ends. Daniel ends on this note that, well, Daniel, your time is done, but there's hope for you. There's hope for your people coming. And that's our sort of our lead into the New Testament.
So, these were only for Hebrews?
Well, it was written in Hebrew.
Okay, but you said that it was really for them because everybody else could read Hebrew, is that right?
Right.
So the Seventh-day Adventists and some of my other friends that take Daniel and put it into the end time, what they think are nowadays.
Yeah.
Is that totally wrong?
Well, partially. In that there's a couple of things there. Remember, Daniel keeps being told, seal this after chapter 7. Notice he's not told that in chapter 7. Right? But 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, he keeps being told, but keep this, seal this, don't talk about this, right? And we notice all of those chapters where he's told that are written in Hebrew that nobody at the time could read. Or almost nobody, right? Meaning he was effectively, by writing it in Hebrew, keeping it from most people, right? With the idea being that God wanted this in writing so that when it happened, people would be able to go and look back and read it and say, right? Yeah, this is exactly what God was saying would happen, right? And we see that, and that becomes a theme at the end of all of the Gospels, right? Like on the road to Emmaus, right? They're confused, they're going home, we thought Jesus was the Messiah, but he died, so oh well, right? And then Jesus goes and explains to them all the scriptures, and then all of a sudden they go, oh, right? And it's sort of it all comes together, right? That's the idea that's being gotten at with the hide the book and that kind of thing, is the idea that, until this stuff starts happening, you're not going to understand what this is about. But once it starts happening, right? Once you see Xerxes, once you see, Antiochus Epiphanes and what he does, once you start seeing these things unfold, you'll understand what this is about, right? And then you'll be able to say, okay, Antiochus Epiphanes, this happened, that's what Daniel was talking about, okay, 245 years, right? You'll understand this when the time comes. Some folks have chosen to interpret that as somehow now is when the time comes. Yeah, and the problem is they've been doing that for at least 500 years. In the 16th century, the Reformers and Luther and stuff, they were just absolutely certain that the Pope was the Antichrist and that all this stuff was happening, right? They're like, look, Daniel said, when knowledge is multiplied, well, we've got the printing press now. Right? They were like, we've got all this technology. That must be now. Right? So this must be the end times, right? And then in the 1700s, Jonathan Edwards, in colonial America is like, well, this must be now, because look, we've spread all over the earth. We're in the new world, right? It's that's a problem. I think the biggest issue, honestly, is that as soon as the bigger chunk of the Protestant world got rid of a lot of the books that are in the Greek and the Latin of the Old Testament, like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, right? They got rid of the books where you could see all these things being fulfilled. Right? Most of the people I've known who are into end times prophecy, if I went up to them and started trying to talk to them about Alexander the Great and his generals, and the Seleucids and Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes, they wouldn't know who I was talking about. Right? Let alone have any idea that be able to see how sort of perfectly these things in Daniel sort of match. Right? Like, remember when we were in chapters 8 and 9, the goat with the one big horn and the small, and how perfectly it sort of matches all this. This is why, remember I said the skeptics say this was written in 200 BC, right? Because there's skeptics who look at this and say there's no way he could have described it that perfectly in advance. Right? There's no way he could have described everything that happened with Alexander the Great and the Persians and all that in advance so precisely. So it must have happened afterwards. And we know there were copies in existence in 200 BC, so they can't date it any later than that. But they date it as late as they possibly can, because it's so on target. But if you don't know about any of that, because you've never heard of 1st Maccabees, and you haven't studied the history, if you don't know any about that, you can't see how perfectly it fits. And so you're left looking at it going, well, what is all this? There's a goat and a bear and and monsters and this, And then somebody comes to you and says, well, bear, look, Russia. Russia's a bear, right? They've got a bear, so that must be Russia. Right? And, and they give you a plausible story that seems like it fits, and people kind of say, well, okay. I can't think of anything else that makes sense of this. So, okay. Right? But we're gonna see the same thing when you get into the book of Revelation. When you get into the book of Revelation, the more you know about the Roman Empire and Roman religion and Roman mythology and stuff, the more you can see in the book of Revelation, oh, this is talking about stuff that was going on when St. John wrote it. He's not just talking about helicopters or tanks or anything like that. This is all really refers. So I think that's the key of why they don't understand it, is because they don't have those books in their Old Testament, and they haven't studied the history outside of the Bible to see how those things are connected. Right? I think it's pretty impressive that he predicted the date of the destruction of the temple hundreds of years beforehand. Right? I think that's enough. I don't think he has to predict, the date of the apocalypse. I'll give him that, right? Or Isaiah predicting the name of Cyrus before the Persian Empire existed. We don't need to try and make him carry more water than than that. I think they did good enough.
Okay, in your statement about the book, certain books not being about, especially Maccabees, I would have to say my own prayer book that I have. It said when we separated from Rome, the books that they threw out, one being the Maccabees and so forth. Okay, I can understand that. And I can understand another church not missing the beauty of the books that this Bible has and they don't have. But having said that, this Bible doesn't have the Book of Enoch, or maybe 30 or 40 other books quote of the Bible.
Yeah.
So with that statement, then what position does that put us in the window of salvation?
Well,
Because it comes down to say, I believe.
right, but my point was regarding those books was that those books help you understand,
Yes.
right? These
Enoch
things.
is a
When we
great
get and when we get into the New Testament, because the book of Enoch, for example, is quoted in 2 Peter and in Jude. When we get there, I'm going to talk about the book of Enoch. So there are going to be times when we get into the New Testament as we go. There have already been times as we went through the Old Testament where I referred to literature outside the Bible because it helps us understand this or that thing. And I'm going to continue to do that in the New Testament. But yeah, that is part of understanding the world in which the things were written, right? Which is the context. And when if you take the text out of its context, you can make it mean anything you want.
Watch the history.
Right? Exactly. It could be all about aliens and flying saucers, right? if you want it to be, right? If you take it out of the context, right? And so that's why it's so important that we understand when these things were written, by who, to who, the context and the culture in which they were written, because it's very easy to misinterpret. The example I've used all the time is how everybody now flinches at the epistle reading during a wedding. As soon as it says wives should obey their husbands, and everybody goes, like oh no, we're a bunch of Neanderthals, right? And if you know anything about Roman culture in the first century, okay, you know that women didn't have a choice but to obey their husbands. Okay, if a woman didn't obey her husband, he could have her killed. Or worse, divorce her. And being divorced was worse because it's not like a woman could go and get a job. So if a man divorced a woman, she was left to begging for the rest of her life. Right? Almost as a beggar. Probably would have to become a prostitute in order to survive. Okay? She didn't have a lot of options. So all St. Paul's really saying to women is, yeah, you have to do what your husband says. Do it cheerfully, don't do it begrudgingly. Right? Whereas he's saying to men, and most of those men in the first century were in arranged marriages that they didn't pick. Right? Their parents made a deal with some other person's parents. Right? Exchanged some goats, and now you at age 13 are married to this woman, who you probably didn't even see before the wedding. Right? So who knows if you find her attractive? Who knows if your personalities match? Who knows about any of that, right? Doesn't matter. You're married now. And St. Paul says to you as a man, you not only need to love her, no matter who she is, no matter what she looks like, no matter what she acts like, you have to love her so much you'd be willing to die for her the way Christ died for the church. So when St. Paul wrote that in the first century, everybody gasped at the part about men loving their wives, right? That was the part that was like crazy, right? The part about women obeying their husband, they were like, yeah. That was not big. But now in our culture, it's flipped, right? In our culture, it's the exact opposite. Right? Our culture is the exact opposite. So we have to understand that original context to really understand and to get what's being said.
But yet you just said it, yet it's in the marriage vow. See,
We don't have vows.
Well, when you go before the altar and that is read, there's that context that what do you think if you tell them, well, hey, this is great, we made a mistake, we gave the women the right to vote. Isn't that terrible? Now what Americans happen, that male ego becomes shattered. And then the feminist movement comes, and and having crossed swords with them, they go back to that part and they say, how dare you? And Paul was just a terrible guy when he said all of this about women.
Because it's out of context.
And I said,
On both
"What are you
sides."
taking it out of, you know? And I guess now that I'm on my soapbox, I'm kind of what concerns me in Christendom in America, don't you? Bob and I were talking before coming in, but it really bothers me in Christendom in America. Boy, I hate to pick on anybody, but you look at, well, you talk about the History Channel. Check out the Christian TV channel every once in a while.
Yeah.
You know, give me a love offering for a few bucks, and we're going to set.
Give you a few more bucks, yeah.
Yeah, a few bucks, and the gospel of prosperity. I
Yeah.
look at this.
They've got some really entertaining shows about the Middle East.
Well, it's
Well,
people can be very misguided by this too.
Right. But that's, see,
Why don't
that,
you go to a person who reads your palm
right.
if you're going to do
But that's why we do Bible study, right? Because if the Bible was, and this is again one of the differences we have as Orthodox with some of our Protestant brothers and sisters is that some of our Protestant brothers and sisters actually teach that the Bible is basically clear and anybody can pick it up and read it and understand it.
And you're okay.
Right?
Yeah.
And
Nah.
parts of it. Yeah, I have to disagree. I mean, I think you have to read it. Everyone, whether they like it or not, is reading the Bible in a context. Whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
Right? You're reading it as even if you're not in the church, you're reading it as a 21st century person with 21st century presuppositions and ideas that aren't the same as the ones of the people who wrote it. And if you're in a church, any church, right, you're reading it in the context of that church's teaching. Right? You're not just objectively knowing it, and we have to have the humility to admit that, right? To admit that we're not just sort of objective and pure and, oh, what I think the Bible says is that's just what it says. Right? That's just what it's, any idiot can read it and see that I'm right. That's what it says. Right? You have to have the humility to say, no, I'm reading it based on my understanding and my tradition, right? In the way that I read and understand it. And we work to improve that. Right? We work to question some of those presuppositions. We work to learn more about, when St. Paul wrote this, what did St. Paul mean? Not just what can I make this mean for me right, today in my life, but what was St. Paul trying to say to me? Right? And so that's what hopefully Bible study is, and hopefully this Bible study is getting back to and sort of improving our context, improving our...
But is not virtue, though, eternal? When we look at it, we have a saying in the organization I belong to, but virtue is brought together. Death cannot separate. So if I look at the Bible, looking at the flip side of what you just said, say there's a virtuous thing here about the word friend. When Jesus says friend, to die for your friend. And I have to agree that in America, we say, boy, I really love this guy, or I love that girl, I really like them, okay? And so I look at the thing of virtue from the New Testament. That has to be eternal, that Christ arose from the dead. That, not
Sure.
only virtue, but what he did as a virtuous man. Can I model my life after this Jesus?
Right. But I would question whether the primary message of the Bible is be virtuous. But we'll get more into this
I'm sorry.
as we go forward.
Taking it
Do you have a question?
No, the St. Paul thing, like with
Yeah.
the wedding thing, because you said it was, you wrote it in a time when women had to obey the rest of the I mean, that's not the time now, and therefore why
Right.
still have it in the sermons?
Well, the idea is the reason why we have sermons is, and we call them homilies. The word homily, because homo means the same, right? The purpose of a sermon is to essentially explain Scripture. So hopefully, the after we read that, right, there's some preaching at the wedding that explains, okay, here's what St. Paul is saying to you as a husband and to you as a as a wife, and explains that and puts it into our context. Right? If that doesn't happen, then that's a problem. Right? Then that's a problem. But yeah, that's why we're supposed to have homilies. Why we don't just stand up and read the Bible and then sit down. Say, well, the Bible said everything there's to say. Right? That's because the goal is to, again, sort of set that context. Right? Here's what that means to you as a particular person now. Right? Sitting here listening today, or standing here getting married today, or baptizing your baby today, or whatever the case may be. Right? That's the goal. And we're going to see when we get into St. Paul, and I want to get back to this last bit of Daniel in a second, but we're going to see when we get more into St. Paul. St. Paul's gotten a really bad rap in terms of his view of men and women. It's really misunderstood because people take sort of modern categories and are throwing them back on him in the first century, you know. And there are several passages like that one in the epistle where the way people interpret him today is literally the exact opposite of what he meant. Literally the exact opposite. A good one being, real briefly, since I brought it up before we get back into Daniel, when he says that women should remain silent in church, right? That one gets quoted all the time. What he's actually saying there is, he's actually referring, the word he uses for silence, Hezekiah, is a word that we use in our monastic circles. Remember the story of Mary and Martha when Jesus comes to their home, and Martha is running around cooking and cleaning and, you know, doing all the stuff, you know, to host Jesus. Whereas Mary is, it says, sitting in silence at Jesus' feet, right? That word is used not just in the scriptures, but outside the scriptures, to talk about someone being a disciple, right? So the idea is that Mary is sitting there listening to Jesus, learning from Jesus, right, and being his disciple, whereas Martha's busy with all this, all this stuff. And Jesus says, Martha says, Jesus, will you tell Mary to get up off her rear end and come help me? I'm doing all this by myself, right? And Jesus says, no, Mary has chosen the better thing, right? What St. Paul's saying in that passage, and we'll go into it more in depth when we get there, is he's saying that women in the church need to be like Mary, right? Need to be like Mary. They need to come to church to learn, right? To listen, to learn, to grow and understand their faith, right? And we'll talk about what he says about men in that passage too. But he's not saying women are dumb and don't know anything, so shut up, right? Which is how it's usually interpreted today. He's saying, no, women need to come to church and they need to learn too, right? It's not just the man, right? And then the woman and the children are his property, right? So he kind of brings them to church with him, you know. But they need to also become.
Had less of a right to have knowledge and all that.
Right. They couldn't go to a school. They couldn't go to Plato's Academy in Athens, right? They couldn't go and go to philosophical schools. Right? But St. Paul is saying, no, they need to, when they come to church, they need to hear and listen and learn for themselves. Become disciples of Christ themselves, independently from their husband. Right? Well, again, that's kind of earth-shattering in the first century. Right? That's about as feminist as you could get in the first century. Right? But now, you know, people interpret it the exact opposite way. You know, as if he's putting that way. But like I said, we'll get to that when we get into St. Paul. A lot of times when you understand the context of what he's saying and who he's saying it to and what he's correcting, right? What were they doing that he's telling them to stop and do this instead, right? You know, that you come to understand he means something very different.
Those who knew my wife would say unadulterated that she was the most liberated woman there was in the world. But she raised 5 of the most male chauvinistic boys.
That'll happen. Okay, so let's do this.
Let me
Oh,
say
sure.
one more thing.
Okay.
What I think St. President, about women having to keep their heads covered so they don't tempt the angels.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll get into that too, but the short version is, if you look at pagan worship at the time, men who were serving as priests wore head coverings. They wore a cloth over their head, right? When they served, and women weren't allowed women weren't allowed to serve as priests at all. There were certain temples where they had women who were sort of cult prostitutes, but they weren't priests the way men were priests. And so what St. Paul is doing in that is he actually flips, right? He tells men they're not allowed to cover their heads. Right? That when they pray, they have to have their head uncovered, and he tells women to cover their heads. So he actually exactly reverses the way the pagans worship. There in that passage. But we'll get more into that when we get there. But see, that's when I was talking about what they were doing that he wants them to stop. Right? See, a lot of times the practices he's forbidding, it's not just St. Paul doesn't like it or he has a pet peeve. A lot of times it's because these things were part of pagan worship and pagan rites, and these people are now converts from paganism to Christianity. And we talked about with the pagan rulers, right? They were perfectly willing to just add one more god to their list.
To the party.
And the problem, particularly in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, that St. Paul is dealing with is he's got a lot of pagan converts who haven't really converted all the way, right? They've sort of just added Christ to the list, right? So now they've got a little statue of Apollo and a little statue of Vesta and a little icon of Jesus, like all in a row. And a lot of what St. Paul is trying to get at in 1st and 2nd Corinthians is you can't do that, right? You can't mix the two, right? It's Christ or it's right or it's paganism. They don't work together. Right? You got to have one or the other. So in a lot of cases, he's trying to get them to stop doing the things that they used to do in pagan worship, right? And instead be Christian. I mean, to be very blunt about it, there's part of 1 Corinthians where St. Paul is correcting them because apparently they were having orgies on Sundays after the Eucharist. Okay, because in Corinth, that's what they did when they went to worship the god. They'd go and offer a sacrifice, and then they'd have a big feast, and then they'd have an orgy. So some of them decided, well, okay, now we're Christians, so we'll go get together and have the Eucharist, and then have an orgy. And St. Paul's going, no!
Not on Sunday.
Yeah, this is not what we do, right? We're done with the orgies now. Right? So, but anyway, we'll get there. But so that's a lot of it. It's him trying to get and that's why he keeps talking about holiness and being set apart and being different than the rest of the world, and all that sort of factors into that issue. But okay, back to let's finish up Daniel here. We have this last little piece, Bel and the Dragon, here at the end of tacked on to the end of the book. So verse 1, this is on page 1261, there's no chapter marker, it just starts with verse 1. When King Astyages was gathered to his fathers, Cyrus of Persia received his kingdom. Daniel was a confidant of the king and was honored above all his friends. Now the Babylonians had an idol whose name was Bel, and every day they spent on it 12 bushels of fine flour, 40 sheep, and 6 vessels of wine. The king adored it and went every day to worship it. But Daniel worshipped his own God. So the king asked him, "Why do you not worship Bel?" Right? You notice he doesn't say, "Why are you worshiping this other weird god?" That's fine with him, right? He's like, "But why are you worshiping this one too?" Right? Why don't you go along with the rest of us? Verse 5, Daniel answered, "Because I do not worship idols made with hands, but only the living God who created heaven and earth and has dominion over all flesh." The king said to him, "Do you not think Bel is a living god? Do you not see how much he eats and drinks every day?" So, hey, we're bringing in all this and sacrificing it to him. He's got to be alive, right? He eats, right? Verse 7, Daniel smiled and said, "Do not be deceived, O king, for it is but clay inside and bronze outside, and it has never eaten or drunk anything." Very angry, the king summoned his priests and said to them, "If you do not tell me who it is that consumes these provisions, you shall die. But if you can prove Bel consumes them, then Daniel shall die, because he blasphemed against Bel." So Daniel said to the king, "Let it be according to your word." Right? So the king feels like, okay, they're making a fool out of me. Right? With this, pretending to, pretended that he's eating this food, and obviously one of them is eating it, right? So he says, okay, you guys better prove that this is really the idol eating the food. If not, it's you guys' heads. But if you can prove it, then Daniel, who's blasphemed this God, it's going to be his head. And Daniel says, well, I'm fine with that, right? I'm pretty confident which way this is going to turn out. Verse 10, now there were 70 priests of Bel besides their wives and children, and the king went with Daniel into the temple. Then the priests of Bel said, look, we will step outside. You, O king, set out the food and prepare the wine, then shut the door and seal it with your signet. If you do not find Bel has eaten it all when you come tomorrow, we will suffer death, or else Daniel shall die who speaks lies against us. They were unconcerned, for under the table they had made a secret entrance, through which they always came in to consume the provisions. Right? Okay. So they sneak in and eat all the food every night, right? Like the cookies for Santa, right? And so they say, oh, king, you set out the food yourself and seal the door and watch what happens. I bet you he eats it. Verse 14, so when they had all gone, the king set out the food for Bel, and Daniel ordered his servants to bring in ashes, which they sprinkled throughout all the temple in the presence of the king alone. Then they went out, shut the door, sealed it with the king's signet, and departed. During the night, the priests came with their wives and children as they usually did, and ate and drank everything. The king rose early the next morning, and Daniel with him. Then the king said, are the seals intact, Daniel? Daniel answered, they are intact, O king. As soon as the doors were opened, the king looked at the table and cried out in a loud voice, greater are you, O Bel, and with you there is no deceit at all. Right? Because he opens the door, hey, look, all the food's gone. Verse 19, then Daniel laughed and restrained the king from going in. He said, look at the floor and notice whose footprints these are. The king replied, I see the footprints of men, women, and children. Right? There's all the footprints of the people who came to eat the food. With great anger, the king seized the priests and their wives and children, and they showed him the hidden doors where they came in and consumed such things as were put upon the table. Therefore the king put them to death and handed Bel over to Daniel, who destroyed it and its temple. Verse 23, there was also a large serpent the people of Babylon worshipped. So the king said to Daniel, will you also say this is made of bronze? Right? So now he's got the serpent. Look, he lives, he eats, and he drinks. You cannot say he is no living God, therefore worship him. So this serpent isn't a statue, right? This serpent is a big serpent. So we're probably looking at either like an anaconda or something, or a Komodo dragon, right? Some kind of large reptile, right? But this thing's actually alive, right? So he says, well, look, this thing's actually alive, right? Look at this great beast. It's alive, it eats, it breathes. You can't say this is just some statue. You gotta worship this thing. Look how amazing it is, right? Verse 25, Daniel replied, I will worship the Lord my God, for he is the living God. But with your permission, O king, I shall slay this serpent without sword or staff. The king said, I will give my permission. Right? So Daniel says, I don't think this thing's so impressive. Right? He's like, I think I can take it out without even any weapons. Right? So verse 27, then Daniel took pitch, tar, and hair. These he boiled together and made cakes and put them in the mouth of the serpent. The serpent ate them and burst open. Then Daniel said, behold the things you have been worshiping. Right? So he said, he gives them essentially the equivalent of giving Alka-Seltzer to a seagull, right? Right? He feeds it, it blows up, right? Bursts open. He says, okay, look, you're 2 for 2, right? Look at you got this carcass here. We got the statue of Bel that you thought was so impressive. Verse 28, now when the people of Babylon heard what had been done, they were indignant and conspired against the king, saying, the king has become a Jew. He has destroyed Bel, slain the serpent, and put the priests to death. Right? So they're like, oh, he's going after some crazy foreign god and not worshiping our gods. In fact, he killed them. Verse 29, going to the king, they said, deliver Daniel to us, or else we will destroy you and your house. Now when the king saw they were pressing him hard, he handed Daniel over to them under compulsion. They threw Daniel into the lion's den, where he was left for 6 days. Now there were 7 lions in the den, and they had to give them 2 carcasses every day and 2 sheep. But these things were not given to them so that they might devour Daniel. Okay, so he ends up back in right, here's your Persian punishment, remember, it's a twofer, the animals kill you and dispose of the body. Right? So they throw him back with the lions, and instead of feeding the lions, they give him nothing for 6 days to make sure they eat Daniel. Verse 33, now the prophet Habakkuk was in Judea. He had made a stew and had broken bread into a bowl, and was going to the fields to take it to the reapers. But the angel of the Lord said unto Habakkuk, go carry the dinner you have into Babylon to Daniel, who is in the lion's den. Habakkuk said, O Lord, I have never seen Babylon, nor do I know the den. Right? Notice he's in Judea. Right? So he's over in Palestine. Daniel's over in Babylon. Right? He just made stew. He's bringing it out to his farm workers. Right? Angel comes to him and says, oh, why don't you go bring that to Daniel in Babylon? He's like, I've never been to Babylon, and even if I had, I don't know where this lion's den, where Daniel is. Verse 36, that the angel of the Lord took him by the crown and carried him by the hair of his head, and with the speed of the wind set him in Babylon over the den. Habakkuk cried out, saying, O Daniel, Daniel, take the meal God has sent you. Daniel said, you have remembered me, O God, and you have not forsaken those who love you. So Daniel arose and ate, and the angel of the Lord immediately set Habakkuk down in his own place once more. After this, on the 7th day, the king went to the lion's den to mourn for Daniel, and he came to the pit and looked inside, and there sat Daniel. The king cried out with a loud voice, great are you, O Lord God of Daniel, and there is no other beside you. Then he drew him out of the den and cast in those who had plotted Daniel's destruction, and they were devoured in a moment before his face. So that's our last little piece of Daniel here at the end. And that's the end of the Old Testament, 4.5 years later. So thank you, everybody, especially those of you who have been here for 4.5 years.
Why are you trying to make it sound so bad?
I can only imagine how terrible it's been for you. But but thank you, everybody. And so next week is the dinner, so we're not going to have class, because everybody's going to be helping with the dinner. Week after that, I believe, is the choir festival. Am I right? I believe the week after that is the choir festival. So I believe our next meeting is going to be on November 1st. And so on November 1st, we're not actually going to start on Matthew. November 1st, the whole thing is going to be sort of intro to the New Testament. So I'm going to talk about, because unlike the Old Testament, the New Testament is all written in one period of time, right? Over the course of about 70 years. So I only have one sort of historical background to talk about for the whole New Testament. So we're going to talk about what happens after the end of the Old Testament in terms of the Romans, and talk about Roman culture and religion and what's going on in Judea, who the Pharisees are, who the Sadducees are, all these kind of things. On the first, that'll be sort of our introduction to the New Testament, and then next class after that will be we'll get started in Matthew.
Will there be advertising for the intro?
There will be advertising for the intro, forthcoming, in the bulletin starting next week, and hanging places. I'll give it to you to put on the interwebs. So, okay, thanks everybody.
Thank you.